today we are honored to have Dr. Leila. Before I pass it on to her, I would just like to read her bio, and I just want to also say thank you to Val for recommending her. So yeah, this is thank you so much to Val, and I think we will enjoy our talk. So Dr. Leila is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and at Texas A&M University. She is a geospatial scientist working on solving hard, real-world environmental problems using remote sensing and machine learning. She has several projects focused on underwater mapping and object detection that seek to develop and implement approaches enabling the use of huge amounts of remote sensing sensed data to find and map features over large areas, either motivated because of manual image analysis is far too time consuming, or because combining different types of or layers of remotely sensed data and then processing using machine learning can produce new information and entirely new layers that would be impossible to calculate or derive using just the human eye. These machine learning approaches enable insights that haven't been possible in the past. Overall, research is focused on 3 areas: machine learning, model generalizability, and methodological transferability, imagery processing, and data annotation and data collection. She has experience working with many types of remote sensed data, including hyper and multispectral, RGB, LiDAR, radar, and sonar, and magnetometer. Her projects include both underwater and terrestrially based. Dr. Character has a bachelor's degree in geology from SWANY, the University of the South. She completed a master's degree and PhD in geography at the University of Texas at Austin. Her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Delaware in the School of Marine Science and Policy was focused on machine learning for underwater aircraft wreck detection using sidescan sonar. She also has professional experience as a geologist, environmental scientist, and at an artificial intelligence startup. Please, that's you can see that's so long. So please help me.
Thank you for the great introduction. I think you've hit it all. So today I'm going to be talking to you about several of my underwater projects. 2 of them are similar applications. One of them is something different. What you'll see is a theme of my work. So I'm going to start with some context. Then I'm going to talk about 3 separate projects, and then I'll wrap up by telling you where I'm headed, both with my existing work and with new areas that I want to focus on. Okay, so getting started. All of my work is centered around this idea of creating optimized pipelines with to use remotely sensed data to do machine learning to solve some problem, some real world pre-existing problem. Everything I work on comes to me from someone else. The problem exists and somebody in some domain, whether it's archaeology, whether it's automatic target recognition, whether it's something related to trees, all of these problems come to me from somebody that has something that they think machine learning could address, but they can't do it themselves, which means I tend to work on a pretty good diversity of projects. But everything I do within this optimized pipeline approach consists of these 5 main steps. So first of all, there's either data collection or data gathering. Some of what I do involves using publicly available data or data that somebody has given me, say airborne LiDAR that's been collected over a large amount of Central America. Some of it I collect myself, whether with a drone or a UAV. Along with the remotely sensed data, everything that I do, because I do object detection, which is a type of computer vision that I'll talk about briefly for those of you that aren't familiar in a couple minutes, but everything I do in addition to needing remote sensing data, it needs XYZ coordinates, so latitude, longitude, and elevation of known locations of whatever features I'm interested in. So that could be shipwrecks, that could be some generic geometric target that the Navy has put on the seafloor, but I need these coordinates because to train an object detection model, you need known examples of whatever it is you're looking for in the remotely sensed data, otherwise you can't do it. So after I do that first step, most of the largest amount of what I do is focused around pre-processing and feature engineering. So manipulating the remotely sensed data in some way that you are able to, it highlights whatever feature it is you're looking for in a way that's more powerful than using the raw data itself. From there, I train whatever machine learning model I'm going to use to recognize different features, and then from there, I evaluate the model's performance and make sure that everything is optimized within the model, both the way that I'm feeding the imagery in, but also the different hyperparameters of the model. And then the last step, and the point of all of this work, is deployment on new data and new areas. So I have a trained model, and it was trained in one place, and now we want to use it to actually really address the problem that's being solved in a new area where we don't have known features. That's the end goal. And the objects that I'm looking for, as I mentioned, they could be shipwrecks, they could be aircraft wrecks, or it could just be classifying different types of seafloor. Those are some of the examples of things that I'll talk about today. Okay, so I think most people sitting in this room are familiar with these types of data, but just in case, I just wanted to have a single slide saying that the two types of remote sensing data sets that I use underwater mainly are multibeam sonar, which I had a great lecture from Val earlier today about multibeam, and sidescan sonar. So, multibeam provides elevation values. Each pixel contains an elevation value, and you can do quite a lot with that, with manipulating the data to produce visualizations that really highlight different elevation features. And then sidescan sonar, which provides essentially a density map of the seafloor. And I use these for different projects. The multibeam is a publicly available data set when I've used multibeam in the past. The sidescan sonar is something I'm out there collecting myself. And thank you to ChatGPT or Gemini or something for generating these lovely drawings to complement my talk. Okay, so just in brief, the way that deep learning works, just a quick flyby 2-minute talk about the way deep learning works, because it's central to the talk I'm giving today, since most of the machine learning models I use are deep learning, is that, say I'm building a model, and the goal of the model is to recognize different aircraft wrecks on the seafloor. Now, this is one of my more complicated deep learning applications, because we're talking about World War II aircraft that were bombed and crashed into the ocean. So not only are these all different aircraft, all different sizes and shapes, but also many of them are in really, really small pieces. And those pieces are, in debris fields that are organized in all different ways. So we're talking about things that don't appear to be the same class of object. Because usually when you're using deep learning, you're using it to detect faces or cats or dogs or, something where it's easy to look from one to the next and recognize them as all the same sort of object. But that's not the case with aircraft wrecks. So the crux of it is the first thing you have to do is you have to get a lot of training data. And if you're thinking that for the example I've decided to use here, that sounds really challenging, a big training data set of underwater aircraft, it is really challenging. It is really challenging, and it's probably the biggest limiting factor with this project. But when I get into talking about this project, you'll understand why this is something that I'm pursuing and how it's possible to have a training data set at all of underwater aircraft wrecks. So, you get as many examples of underwater aircraft wrecks as you can in whatever type of imagery you're interested in using. So in this case, it's sidescan sonar. And once you have a good data set, which is usually thousands of images of whatever it is you're looking for, you can begin to train a model. And just, in common non-computer science language, the way that it works is a deep learning model decomposes this aircraft into all the patterns that spatially represent different parts of the aircraft. So for instance, maybe the tip of the wing here has some stripe patterns, and those, these little micro patterns represent the stripes that, if you look very closely at the wing is composed of stripes, and, different parts of the aircraft are composed of, these kind of irregular blobs, etc. So it spatially decomposes the aircraft, whatever it is you're looking for, in this case an aircraft, into all different type of representative micro patterns. And then those are all stacked up and iterated through really, really quickly. And what it does is it learns this micro representation of all the different ways that parts of aircraft can look. And then when it sees these same patterns, but in a different configuration, in a different location, or the same combination of patterns, it says, hey, I think there could be an aircraft here. And I'm either, really confident or not so confident. And that, that like deep stack, the deep stack of all these representative patterns is what makes deep learning so powerful, but you have to have a big data set to make it work really well. And specifically, the type of deep learning I do down here is not image classification, which would just be I show a model an image and it says, yes, this is an airplane, no, this is not an airplane. What I do is a bit more complicated. I know there are some people here that do it as well because I've been talking to them today. I do object detection, so it's both detection and localization, or classification and localization. So what is in the image and where is it? And that is much more powerful. It's not so useful just to have an image and know that in the image there are 7 shipwrecks. You also need to know where they are in the image because theoretically you're planning on diving on it or sending an ROV down or something. So you need that fine spatial information. Okay. So, now you're possibly wondering, but why? Who is funding this? And, what is exciting and important about this work? So just to state the broadest, I think, motivation for doing this work, automated approaches speed up comprehensive survey and mapping. When you're collecting massive amounts of data, it can be hard to keep up with going through all of that data. And in turn, human beings are not so systematic. To go through data every day in the same way and mark things comprehensively and systematically can be a challenge for a human. But for a computer program, that's what they're designed to do. So you can use the same approach based on a model you've created to comprehensively map data every day, map features across the data set. That means that you can maximize the resources and time that you would have put toward having a human being look at all this data manually every single day. Instead, you can put those time and resources into diving, into ROVing, into lab work, into other types of computer work. Also, out of all of this work, my goal is to build generalizable approaches. So I've already said this, but just because it is really central to what I do, the goal is not just to build a model and show it works. There are a ton of papers where they just build models and then they're like, we held back some of our training data, we tested the model on it, it worked great. Cool, I mean, that's nice. But in the real world, the purpose of building these models is to run models on new areas that they've never seen before. So I'm working toward that generalizability. And then last, I had a good conversation about this yesterday, but accuracy and better than human accuracy is the real goal. Are we there yet? Probably not. I don't think, the model, for instance, the model for aircraft wrecks is not a standalone model right now. It's a model where you still have a human looking over its shoulder. And a lot of this, what I'm going for is a human in the loop approach. So you've got like a model and a human working together where the human is kind of spot checking or checking the model until we build it to a point where we're confident in its accuracy and can trust it. And that confidence, required confidence level, it changes depending on what you're working in. You hear people talk a lot about like, when is a model going to be accurate enough for us to trust it? And that's a sliding scale bar and it depends a lot on your application. If we're talking like machine learning for cancer detection, that's going to be a really different level of required accuracy than some of the stuff I'm working on. So, but these are all things that are part of thinking about what is an accurate or good model. Now, in terms of who am I doing this work for, I have 2 people that I've done a lot of work for. One of them is the Navy has an Office of Underwater Archaeology, and they have funded some shipwrecks work, and then the Defense Prisoners of War Missing in Action Association, which I'm going to call DPAA from this point forward because it's a mouthful. They have a vested interest in finding aircraft in which service members are, that contain the remains of missing in action service members from various US conflicts. So they have ongoing funding to find these aircraft, working with historians, and it's a very big multidisciplinary project. And this image here, believe it or not, is from a documentary about when the DPAA first started funding people to find aircraft. This is real. This is like not a joke. Like, this is like at some point a long time ago, although not that long ago, because you can see the boat and such. This is how they were looking for aircraft. So you can imagine that this is not, I mean, this is an extreme example, but not very practical.
Is that art on the left?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Doesn't surprise me.
All right. Lastly, the last point that I wanted to make is I already talked about huge amounts of data, and it's impossible to keep up with them without integrating automated approaches. But more than that, on top of that, the integration of the different pre-processing approaches for imagery and machine learning also means that you can produce new insights that you just would never have been able to produce manually, either because it just would take too much time to get to those conclusions, or because the combination of the different imagery approaches and maybe fusing imagery produce new information that you just couldn't get by manually looking at imagery. And here is a very, very blurry version of a deep learning model running to detect different pieces of aircraft debris, and you see how fast it's going. There's no human that can move that fast. And that's just a few tiles, obviously, that I'm showing. That's maybe like 20 or 30 images. But, in a single day of collecting imagery, we might end up with 10,000 of these. So, imagine going through that manually versus running a model like this, and you can see, if you kind of squint your eyes, that there are boxes being drawn around predicted features that are either entire aircraft or pieces of aircraft. So, these things can be very fast. All right, so the first project that I'm going to talk about is machine learning for shipwreck detection, which is, in fact, I didn't always, so you heard Elias say that I work both underwater and terrestrially. I think 2017 or 2018 was when I first started working underwater. That's not where I started. I started on land, and this was the first underwater project that I began working on. This project is with the U.S. Navy's Office of Underwater Archaeology, and they, I applied to do some work with the Navy, and I wasn't really sure how my skill set fit. And they had this existing project. They had this idea for, some data that they had, which of course was not the right resolution or really usable at all. But there were other data, and they wanted to know, could we use machine learning? Could you use machine learning to accurately find shipwrecks that they're not aware of? And that's because as the Naval History and Heritage Command, which underwater archaeology is part of, just part of their purview is to maintain, map, and be aware of all shipwrecks, all US shipwrecks around the world. So this project was, I used training data from all different places around the United States and Puerto Rico. So anything in blue here, you can see I used some data off the coast of these states. This data set was multibeam, 1 to 3 meter spatial resolution. I did try to use lower resolution. I tried to use 5 meter resolution. I tried to use 10 meter resolution. That didn't work well. That was a limiting factor with this. And these data come from NOAA's Office of Coastal Management. And you can see an example of some of these data down here. I think this is off the coast of Key West, nice blue water. And then for the known locations, the known XYZ locations of shipwrecks, I used, again, publicly available data from NOAA Wrecks and Obstructions database. And that database, which is shown all the way up here, contains something like 15,000 wrecks. However, many of those wrecks are labeled with a flag indicating that the GPS coordinates are very inaccurate. So at the time I was doing this, I filtered it down to 163 individual wrecks with good GPS coordinates that I felt confident in the location of. So for this project, I now have a different and smoother method of doing this pre-processing, but this works too. So the first thing that I did at the time was I visualize the raw digital elevation model data over here as a hillshade. So that's just, shining a light from a specified angle that creates a pattern of shadowing and light across the landscape and can help, depending on where the lens comes from, it can either make things less or more visible. And in this case, it made features more visible. So this is the shipwreck here. And then from there, I annotated or labeled all of my shipwrecks in my training data using a Microsoft tool, the VOTT, I labeled bounding boxes. As you can see here, I drew bounding boxes around shipwrecks, fairly simple. Then I also did, one more thing I want to mention is that, so in addition to those 163 shipwrecks, most machine learning models, though not all, it's not a hard and fast rule, perform better if you have absence points as well, not just presence points. So I also, for this project, I had 163 images of just background topography, various types of background topography that were not shipwrecks, as part of my data set, as part of my training data set. The last thing I did is, because 163 shipwrecks is not thousands of shipwrecks, as I said earlier, you usually have thousands of images of things for deep learning, I augmented my data set. So that's a common practice in deep learning where you manipulate either rotating or skewing or recoloring sometimes your images so that you synthetically create or artificially create a larger data set. Then for the machine learning part of this model, I used an object detection model called YOLO, or You Only Look Once. It's a single stage object detector. And in around 2018, when I was first doing this work, at the time it was the newest, most stable object detection model that had been shown to produce fast results in near real time. And for that reason, I used it. You'll see in my next project, which is something that has been active a little more recently, that I use an updated version of this. But YOLO works really well in complex backgrounds and on small objects, which is very important to all of the work I do. When you're talking remotely sensed imagery, whether it's shipwrecks or especially aircraft wrecks, you generally have a lot of background topography and very small objects that you're looking for, and you don't know where they are. So it's not like you're zoomed in or anything. You just have like a big area that you're searching. So at the time that I was doing this work, I chose a YOLO model that had been pre-trained on a transfer learning data set, very, very common in deep learning. So generally when you run object detection models, you are not training from scratch. You're not using a model that knows nothing and then teaching it to recognize shipwrecks. You're using a model that's been trained on one of these giant transfer learning data sets. So this particular model was trained on a transfer learning data set called ImageNet 1000, which is composed of hundreds or maybe thousands of these different classes, mammal, carnivore, canine, dog, that have nothing to do with shipwrecks whatsoever. But it has been since shown, at the time it wasn't. At the time this was kind of like a strange choice that I made, but it has since been shown, not just by my work, but by many others, that starting an object detection model with a pre-trained transfer learning data set produces better results every single time, regardless of whether what you're detecting is in that transfer learning data set or not. If what you're detecting is in that transfer learning data set, then great. That's really going to help. That's going to make a significant difference. So this particular model with the multibeam data set, what it produces is it's a tile of imagery that goes in, and then what it produces is an output classification with a bounding box labeling what it believes to be shipwrecks, and that bounding box has a confidence score. It has a confidence score attached to it. So in this case, it's 0.76 or 76 out of 100% confident that that's a shipwreck. That confidence score can be used to set threshold-specific accuracy metrics where you only classify things as shipwrecks above some predefined confidence score. In this case, for the work that I'm doing, because, so this project, there was no diving, but we almost always are ground truthing the results. And because we're ground truthing, we're often very concerned that we don't dive on false positives. So for that reason, we often look at recall and precision because, you know, depending on what you're interested in, precision, if you don't want to dive on a lot of false positives, for example, you want to consider precision. But just as a general nice summary metric, the F1 score provides a nice summary. So this particular model is fairly high performing. It worked pretty well. 0.92 out of 1. In the context of other related work, since I have worked on this project, there have been several other projects that have attempted to use machine or deep learning and a data set of shipwrecks to detect shipwrecks in new places. You can see that a lot of them are in Lake Huron because there's a lot of shipwrecks there. So in comparison with this work, something that is fairly different about what I tried to do and maybe more challenging is that the study area is large and, you know, around several states around the coast of the United States and Puerto Rico, which means that the bathymetry and the environment change. They change more than you would expect in maybe a single location. The data set itself is substantial, but as you can see, not the largest. Something that is really interesting and I find genuinely surprising is there's this recent paper, just like I saw this maybe like a month ago, with over 1,000 shipwrecks off the, you know, along the coast of England. And it's really an exciting paper. But what's confusing is that their accuracy score, that F1 I showed you, they test all these different object detection models, and their F1 score never gets above 50%. And I honestly do not know what is going on with that. And in fact, they don't either, because when they're explaining their results, they actually cite me and they say, we think that maybe what happened is Leila used negative samples and we did not. Now, I don't know if they ran out of time or what happened, why they didn't test that, to see, because I would like to know what's going on. I will say something that I don't think they considered that I have encountered with others is they ran their model in ArcGIS Pro. They did not run their model in Python. And I have just word of mouth, I have heard from graduate students trying to do deep learning in ArcGIS that it doesn't work well. It's very buggy, you have very limited control over it. And for that reason, that would be my first guess. If I worked with them, the first thing I would suggest is let's try your same data set, let's pop it into like a Python-based YOLO and see what comes out. I have trouble believing that with over 1,000 shipwrecks, their model has such poor accuracy. And you know, additionally, there is something to be said for these open source data sets. So you know, not everything can be open source, especially when things contain human remains. But you know, open source data sets, especially that are accessible to other people interested in this stuff, maybe underwater archaeologists, as QGIS plugins, for example, have a lot of power. I also did some pattern and statistical analysis after doing the machine learning to see if there were unique geomorphometrics that characterize shipwrecks as compared to background topography. And I found that, each of these box and whisker plots on the right is related to the shipwreck, and then the ones on the right that say BT are background topography. So I found that both the curvature of the slope as well as the slope values itself were pretty distinct for shipwrecks versus background topography. And you know, this is something that can be used in future models where you take different visualizations of the LiDAR and provide the model with that additional information as additional layers for detection, or a random forest type model where you're actually feature engineering and providing the model with a numerical representation as opposed to the picture itself of the data. I also looked at just some parameters that are relevant maybe to like what data is available and also the performance of the model in shallow versus deep water, and found that most of these shipwrecks are within 7 or so kilometers of the coast. And accordingly, most of the shipwrecks in the data are quite shallow. Most of them are 40 meters or shallower. So we're not talking about things that are very deep. And of course, for this to be really useful, it needs to be trained on data that is also really deep. And overall, the data were from several different states, but there was a lot available in the Long Island Sound and the Puget Sound as well. Lots and lots of wrecks there. To give you an idea of how shipwrecks looked at different depths, here are some wrecks at a variety of different depths. But of course, it's not, sure, it's a function of depth, of spatial resolution, and of environmental conditions. So there's a lot of things influencing this, but because this project was done for Navy archaeology, and because a lot of underwater archaeologists are interested in this approach, it's important to consider things that I didn't consider as part of this, like how the material of the shipwreck affects machine learning and how decomposition takes place over years and years and years. And for this reason, I have a new collaborator who is an underwater archaeologist at Texas A&M, and he's focused on all of that, and I'm focused on the machine learning, and he has a bunch of deep data sets from around Europe and Israel. So there will be more about this and more work toward answering some of these questions that
Leila, if I can just interrupt you for
Sure.
that last slide, just to clarify, that 3 meter, 25 meter, that's the water depth?
The
That's
water
not the
depth,
spatial
yes.
resolution?
The water depth. Yeah, this is all 1 or 3 meter spatial resolution data.
Okay, but they're all different sonars that are
Yes, they're all different. Yeah, they're all different multibeams. Yes.
with the same spatial resolution?
Yes, they have all been downscaled or processed to the same resolution. Yes.
Great, thank you.
And that being said, though, I do have not this model, but I have other models where I don't use the same spatial resolution, because sometimes that's important. Like if you're building these generalizable sensor agnostic approaches, you can't necessarily require, everyone have 50 centimeter spatial resolution. Okay, so next is a project using machine learning for aircraft wreck detection. You've heard me talk a lot about this. This is a lot of what I've worked on over the last several years. And this beautiful picture is not an internet picture. This is for those of you that know Mark Moline. We had no good pictures of the AUV collecting data because it's hard. It's hard to capture a picture of it moving, and also it's like sharp and it sends out pings of sonar that hurt your ears if you're in the water. But Mark spent a day or some hours diving with his giant camera above, this is a Japanese Zero, to capture this picture, which is maybe my favorite picture of all time. This is in Micronesia. Okay, so this project, like I said, is funded by the DPAA, and that's because they're interested in repatriating the remains of missing and action service members. This is a very practical application project. So we are out there looking for this aircraft. We do find them. I've been part of finding several American aircraft. It's not easy. And sometimes we go places and we don't find what we're looking for, which is really expensive and really disappointing. But after we find them, the DPAA has another team that actually does repatriations, and they do happen. Since I've worked with the team, there have been several repatriations. In fact, on August 25th, one of the repatriations from Denmark had a funeral in DC, and our entire team attended, except for me because it was the first day of class. But this is like it is a project that is being used. And this project, we have done fieldwork in all the places you see in green here. So a couple places in the United States, Europe off the coast of West Africa, where we still have not found what we're looking for, and a lot of work in the North Pacific as well. So in the Marshall Islands and in Micronesia, where there was the Battle of Truk Lagoon or Chuk Lagoon, we've done a lot of work there. This is not a multi-beam based project. This is sidescan sonar collected at 600 and 1200 kilohertz. And some of the data is archival, so it was collected by this team you see here before I started working with them with a couple different towed sidescan systems. But more recently, we use this AUV and I think a marine sonic sidescan sonar. For this project, data is always the issue, and I will explain how I made 19 aircraft work over the next couple of slides, because it's a little more complicated than just 19 aircraft. But my training data set for this is composed of 19 unique aircraft, And I mean, this took like 8 years to collect this data set. So this is a hard data collection problem. To give you an idea of all the different ways that aircraft wrecks and aircraft debris look in side-scan sonar, so this is aircraft, that's aircraft, there's an aircraft in this picture that I have a lot of trouble finding because it's not visible. No, I think it's probably this. Down here, there's aircraft, it's this little shiny line right here. This is aircraft broken into a million pieces, this stuff, and then that guy. So, you know, it all looks very different. Sometimes, occasionally, it's the size of a car. Most often, it's like the size of like a cell phone, you know, or a computer screen. It just gets really broken up. It does not look the same, and it's really, really complicated when you're working somewhere that there's a lot of rocks or coral. So that's what's going on here. There's coral and there's rocks, and man, you wouldn't believe how much like an aircraft, we call them Christmas tree coral, which is not the correct name, but they're, you know, coral that stand up and have a lot of arms, and sometimes they look identical. I would swear that they're aircraft. So it can be very challenging. Now, for those of you in this room, I know there's at least a couple people here that work on creating synthetic sonar data, maybe not side-scan sonar, but other types of synthetic data to represent the seafloor. It's a natural question to wonder, how about increasing the size of the data set with synthetic training data? And this is a great, it is an interesting idea and an idea that I'll continue to pursue, but right now, 100% of published work that I've seen that is doing machine learning for aircraft wreck detection is using synthetic data. As far as I know, we have the largest, at 19 aircraft, we have the largest training data set of real underwater aircraft wrecks, at least that's published. Everybody else is using a training data set, a synthetic training data set, for the most part, that's called seabed objects, KLSG, something like that. And it contains all different kinds of objects. So shipwrecks, aircraft wrecks, tires, corpses, you know, for drowning victims. But you can see that it looks very different. So this is the synthetic training data set from seabed objects. These are some of the aircraft, and this is our real data. It really doesn't look similar. So I think right now for the state of generating synthetic data using these data, for running models using synthetic aircraft wreck data, we have a long way to go to really be able to use that and say that like these results can be translated to use in the real world. Here are the various countries that these aircraft come from. Again, there's an interest in this with generalizability. So I take data from whatever sensor at whatever resolution from whatever country with different bathymetry that I can get it. And most of this I've been involved in collecting myself, which means I can experiment with how high we fly the AUV and what speed we're moving and frequency and things like this. Overall, because these things are in fragments, they're not intact. The total number of actual fragments, which I labeled individually, is 290. And then from there, I augmented these data into 810 individual images, which, that's not 810 individual aircraft, but that's still more powerful than just having 19 images. I think it would be impossible to train a model with 19 images. So instead, I had 810. And the data totals an area of approximately 180 kilometers squared. The first step of pre-processing, which is the next step on the pipeline here, is mosaicing and annotation. So mosaicing the lines of the sonar into a single image. I tried running deep learning at one point on individual lines of sonar, but that's very, very computationally demanding and it slows the model down. And the issue here is that this model is being run in near real time. So we get off the boat, I'm running the data and we're using the machine learning results to dive or ROV or collect more data the next day. And we are often in places with no internet connectivity. So everything needs to run on this laptop you see here. I can't use a supercomputer, so I'm limited. Things have to be like lightweight and portable. And then from there, I labeled the data in ArcGIS Pro this time, which is much more efficient since this is a spatial question. And then I output the shapefile and converted it into the format required by the new version of YOLO I use, which instead of YOLO version 3 is YOLO version 7. I tested both 7 and 8 because they're newer versions that are both more powerful and faster. For this particular model, I tested all different parameters and hyperparameters. You can see some of them here. I changed the pixel size, not the pixel size, the tile size, and the training data set size, and the epochs, and the batch size, and the number of true negatives, and what I landed on is over here. I think possibly the most interesting part of this is that this model performed worse when I incorporated absence points. I don't understand that. That's something that requires further investigation. I ran, probably like 70 versions of this model, and uniformly it performed worse with true negatives. That's something that is both interesting and confusing to me. I also found that a relatively small batch size of 16 worked well, but also much bigger than that just wouldn't work at all. The computer would crash. So I'm limited by the hardware that I'm running this on. Something that was surprising but important is that this is a relatively small data set. So generally with deep learning, you see training taking place over 100 or hundreds of epochs where it's iterating through the model again and again. But because my training data set is so small, I found that the model began to overfit after about 25 epochs, and that it was important to keep the number of epochs very short, very small. This model, no surprise, is not as good as the shipwrecks model because this is a much harder problem. The aircraft wrecks all look really, really different. So, this is a starting point, but there's more work to be done here. I also did a big assessment of the maximum spatial resolution that the model would work well with, because since we're doing this in near real time and the eventual goal is that maybe this is being run on board an AUV, it's important to have as a non-computationally demanding model, as lightweight a model as possible. So that means we don't want to be generating things in really high resolution unless we need to. You can see this is an aircraft that is a big piece of debris, but then there's all these little bits. And really, I found that 10 centimeters works a lot better. It's not just a little bit. I guess it's like no surprise for anybody that deals with spatial resolution. But when you get into small pieces like this, they're almost completely lost by the time you get to 1 meter. If you generate this in 5 meters, they are completely lost. The model doesn't work at all. And same thing here. This is 1 meter resolution data, and this no longer looks like anything at all. So high resolution is still very important here. And what I will note is that even we collect 1200 kilohertz data. Once we see something in the machine learning and we're interested in doing a reacquire to see what it might be in higher resolution. But this whole model was trained on imagery collected at 600 kilohertz because when we're doing a broad area search, that's the frequency at which we're collecting data. And then from there we do actually ground truth predictions. When we've run the model for 2 seasons over new data, collected new data, and ran the model. We either dive. This is a tail of a Japanese aircraft, or an aircraft that turned out to be Japanese, and then this is Dan, the archaeologist that we work with, putting the ROV over the side to ground truth something that is too deep. Over the last couple summers, we found 4 things that we now know to be aircraft, and the model correctly identified A, B, and C, but the model missed this one. This is like a giant, it's a Betty bomber. It's a Japanese aircraft. It's very, very large, and it's very, very intact because it didn't get bombed. And the model completely missed it, which at the time that it was happening, it didn't feel great. We were all in a room together and we were going through the model results, and it became clear that the model had missed this giant aircraft. But I've seen this in other machine learning models, that even if a feature is the clearest, best example of what it is you're looking for, if the model hasn't seen anything like this, it hasn't seen an aircraft anywhere near this size, it hasn't seen an aircraft that's this intact, that causes problems for deep learning, because deep learning is only as smart as the data you give it. So now the model, this has been integrated into the model, and we've since found other things like this, and it detects them. But the model will really only be trustworthy once it's been shown a pretty great diversity of different aircraft. So now winding down into this is my newest work. This is where I'm sure people are going to have the most questions, and I'm not going to be able to answer them because we're just starting this project. This was just funded from NavAir, from the Naval Air Warfare Aircraft Division, and we are just starting with it. Broadly, it's a sensor fusion project where a new type of sensor, a modulated underwater laser imaging system, is being integrated with an existing REMUS we have. And this is multidisciplinary, so that part I'm not involved with. And then there's a dual phase machine learning model for target detection that I'll talk about just a little bit. Here, because I know there's lots of people that are into sensors in this room, this is the part that I'm not involved with. Here's the REMUS 600 in the water. It's substantially larger than the REMUS 100 that we use for sidescan sonar data collection. And this is representing how the MULLUS will be integrated with the REMUS 600, as well as some more batteries. So the first part that I will be involved with is data collection. So we're collecting both sidescan sonar with the REMUS 100 and then MULLUS data with the REMUS 600 over the same area. What we're going to be looking for is just these geometric targets. There's one here, there's one here. Those will be on the seafloor against different bathymetric settings and different environmental conditions, because a big part of what we're going to try to do here is determine how machine learning works under different environmental conditions, different turbidity conditions. So we have some of the configurations that we plan on testing down here. And then probably the most complicated step will be processing the MULLUS data and fusing it with sidescan sonar into what I think is going to be a 2-band image. But there's some other data from MULLUS as well that may be integrated separately, not as imagery. For this model, it's now really over the last year or two, we're seeing YOLO surpassed as the fastest, most accurate, lightweight object detection model. It's being surpassed by a class of model called transformers. So I think that for this model, there's a good chance that I'm going to use something called a detection transformer and compare that to YOLO and see how it works. What I anticipate being produced is similar to the YOLO models I've already showed you, where there will be a bounding box produced, and those bounding boxes will probably be in pixel space, not in geospatial space, and that will then have to be converted back into geospatial space so that we have an accurate location for these targets. And then the last part of this is what we proposed is another machine learning model where they're kind of end to end. So we have the deep learning model, and then once the transformer has finished, we're proposing a ranking approach with a random forest type model where the predictions are ranked based on different geomorphic characteristics to provide further, and the reason for this is the reason that we want the ranking is because this is a phase 1, but what we have in mind for a potential phase 2 is that this is all going to go on board the vehicle, and we're going to collect. The MULLUS is really, really, really battery hungry. It takes a lot of power. So we're going to do the first deep learning model with sidescan sonar. We're then going to rank the targets. Based on that ranking, we're going to trigger the MULLUS, and then the MULLUS will go and do reacquires at super, super high spatial resolution of the targets of the first 3 or the first 4 targets. But for now, this is going to be a human in the loop approach where we're iterating with the model to tell it which ranking is correct and which ranking is not. And then wrapping up here, in terms of the work that is completed and is already done, in terms of the work that I have already built models for, so the aircraft wreck project and the shipwreck project. Of course, more data. More data is the first part of this. So the shipwrecks is on its way to having more data. I have additional collaborators. The aircraft wreck project is something that either will always be slow or other people working in this field we have to share data. And that's a little bit complicated because it's government funded, and it's a little bit, a lot of it is confidential because it includes human remains, so that makes the project complicated. But there are other people collecting these data, outside of our group. Additionally, different types of remote sensing data will make all of this stuff more powerful. So creating these multi-band images or these raster stacks, whether it's multibeam and sidescan, or magnetometry. So we have this black thing on the front is a custom housing that was built to house a magnetometer that was designed to be mounted on a drone, but we tested it out underwater. You can see an example. This is an aircraft wreck and sidescan sonar. Here it is in magnetometer data. Here these two images are stacked. So this could offer some power when looking for aircraft wrecks, but the sensor doesn't. It's very, very finicky and really requires quite a bit more integration to be really useful and not a pain to process. Additionally, I think that the next direction involves manipulating the data into these data visualizations to produce new or additional information. So you can see this is common with LiDAR, but can also be done with multibeam, where you have, this is the same image 3 times, where there has just been some mathematical operation done on the imagery to make, for instance, small scale changes in slope more obvious, and large slope changes or large topographic changes, it blurs them out, a simple local relief model. And there are several of these that you can do and then manipulate the data in such a way that features become more obvious, and then you can stack all of these up, because depending on the slope and the sort of thing you're looking for across a single landscape, the same visualization model might perform better or worse in different areas. And all of that is to improve model accuracy. That's the shipwreck model, at least as far as the data I tested with works well, but it's been only tested around the coast of the United States. The aircraft wreck model is a good start, but there's a lot of work to be done with that. And then the last thing I will mention before I sum up everything is a project that we currently have a funding request out for. It hasn't been awarded, but it would be exciting if we got it. And that is multimodal machine learning for seafloor characterization along an area we've already done work. So off the coast of Côte d'Ivoire, off the coast of West Africa, the Côte d'Ivoire is currently interested in creating 5 marine protected areas, but there's no data of the seafloor at all. So it's hard to determine where marine protected areas should be and how large they should be without having any of that information. So because I'm always thinking big, I proposed, and the group proposed, that we begin to create a machine learning model with these classes you see up here, rock, sand, mud, marine debris, etc., off the coast of West Africa, using some sensors, various sensors, sidescan sonar, multibeam, maybe magnetometry on the Falcor 2, and that we begin to create this machine learning model that can automatically classify the seafloor into these different classes, and that over time, other data that people collect can be dumped into that until it's a really big, generalizable, powerful model that can automatically produce a classification of your data set and is just publicly available. So just to tie this all up, because I did talk about several different projects, overall, the approach that I'm using here, or what I'm focused on, is building optimized pipelines where I take imagery and data and I use the same methodology, same number of steps, but I optimize the steps for whatever the data set I'm using and feature I'm looking for is. And in general, what I'm looking at is landscape scale patterns across complex backgrounds. Sometimes that's underwater, sometimes it's not underwater. And sometimes it's in multiple countries. I have terrestrial projects as well that are spanning multiple countries with really, really different topography. Everything I do is designed to be sensor agnostic, so I'm generally trying to train on data from as many sensors as possible. And that means that models can generalize to new areas. They're not only useful in the particular study area that the model is trained. And that is all I have.
First, I thought it was a great presentation. Really appreciate that. You use both sidescan and bathymetry data, and you train models on each of them. I assume because you showed us plots of curvature that you're taking advantage of the 3D nature of the bathymetry in the model.
Well, what I haven't done is anything with a point cloud. So
You're just using edges and shapes then?
that's right. The point cloud approach is an area that people have had success with because, well, at the time that I did the shipwrecks, it was the first time I'd worked underwater, so I just focused on getting a model to work. What's happened is the things that I'm working on now are so focused on near real time. When you work with a point cloud, it requires a whole different computing system. You couldn't run it on anything like this, and it just slows everything down. It's more accurate, but at the cost of increased latency.
You can think about the tremendous degree of freedom that's provided by height information.
Yeah.
I've seen lots of things that look like wrecks, but they're way too high or way too low.
Yeah, well, so I am using elevation, but not, so there's like every pixel has a X and Y coordinate, and then it has a Z value. So I am using that Z value in the models, but not in a truly 3D way.
Okay, thanks.
Kind of a higher level question. So the challenge with the aircraft problem is that you have very few examples of aircraft and underwater data. But we have endless examples of just natural seafloor.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering why the idea is to train the model on aircraft and not just train it to say, this looks like plain seafloor, and then it can detect what, anything that's man-made or doesn't look normal. Is that just a more challenging approach?
I don't think that if you're doing deep learning, then you'd have to have a bunch of examples of what doesn't look normal. Because specifically the way that object detection works is it's drawing these bounding boxes. So it's not classifying every pixel of the seafloor. Because if you're mainly interested, if you're interested in just detecting things that aren't seafloor, I think the approach that I would use for that is a segmentation model where every single pixel is being classified so that you could have that background class. I think that the other thing that I would think about with an approach like that is, this is not true of everywhere that we work, but we have done a lot of work in the North Pacific in areas that there were big battles during World War II. And in those areas, there's so much garbage. There's so much stuff under the water. Sometimes we have like 300 man-made objects in a given, 2 kilometer squared study area. Actually, which makes use of the magnetometer challenging as well, because it's all metal. I think that potentially with a segmentation approach, you could work on that, but I don't know that the model would be smart enough, having not seen examples of things that are not, it's easier to look for the positive case of aircraft wrecks than for the negative case of this does not look like seafloor without training data.
Jere?
I think that case where the model detected the aircraft wrecks that were broken up, but didn't detect the full plane is really interesting. And I was wondering, did you randomly split your data set into training and test when you were going through and building your data set?
Yes, I did, and I actually tried several. I retrained it with several versions with different random splits, with a cross-validation approach to see what happened. At that time, I was at the time that it missed that big aircraft wreck, I had identified what I thought was the best performing model and was just running it in the field.
Do you have an idea of what that best split, how many intact and how many broken up wrecks are in the training versus in the testing?
I don't. That is a good question and something that's probably worth looking at. I would say that overall in our data set of 19 aircraft, there's probably 5 that are intact. Or more or less intact, and the others are not. But that is definitely worth looking at.
Are you using snippets to train with, and how do you adjust the snippets so that they're consistent?
Yeah, so all YOLO models have some specified tile size that they use. I think some older versions of YOLO required, maybe like 498 by 498 pixels as input. The newer version, you can input whatever you want, but it automatically resizes everything before object detection to 640 by 640 pixels, at least for YOLO version 7. So that's something that is really nice about YOLO, is other machine learning models, you have to do a lot more to standardize the size of the tile that you feed in, but YOLO does most of that itself.
About the intensity of the side scan image?
That is not something that I've worked with at all. I take the image and mosaic it, and I adjust a few things that I could show you in SonarWiz what it is I do. I don't remember the parameters that I adjust, but I have not. That actually is a question that I've asked a few people. I think it's related to a question I've asked a few people, and that is whether there are ways that I could be manipulating the side scan sonar imagery, either whether it's by performing actual math on each pixel like I do with LiDAR and multibeam to provide to create a visualization, or it's maybe by manipulating intensity and other things about the imagery.
So I know you're very limited by the size of your data sets and availability, but because the nature of the wrecks are so different compared, like you have your full wrecks that might be fresher versus the extremely degraded ones, have you considered doing kind of a subclass of training where you identify those like full wrecks versus the wreckage fields, and they're two different classifications?
I have not, but I think that could be a really good idea. I think that could be a really good idea that would really improve, it with a caveat, but it would improve model performance. That being said, I don't know if, I think that where the model, so it is when we collect generally 2 squared kilometers at a time in a day. And then that's the size of the sonar. If we're just visually, manually, the 5 of us in a room together reviewing the data, we go through each of those lines, line by line, and maybe it takes an hour to 2 hours, depending on how many targets there are. And it is, on the one hand, it's easy. When you have an intact aircraft, we don't miss it. There's no confusion, but it's still 1 to 2 hours. So there probably is utility, and it would be explaining it to the people that fund us, who I'm currently writing a phase 2 with them. So maybe that's something I put into the phase 2. It would allow me to work more on the hard problem while having a model that performed probably pretty strongly for the things that are more intact.
As someone who's done machine learning both inside and outside of ArcGIS Pro, I can add my testimonial to the fact
I'd love to here. Yeah.
ArcGIS Pro doesn't work very well, both from my research experience and other scientists I've talked to. I was just curious, you were talking about that other group who had a very low F score working within ArcGIS Pro. What tool or what were they using within?
I think what they were using was the whole deep learning package where you can choose. I don't remember the name of the specific tool. I haven't used it, but I had a graduate student who used it. And it's, you can choose YOLO or faster RCNN or a single shot detector. There's a whole menu of models, and it's multiple steps. First you create your training data set, then you train, then it generates a .ecw or file, something like that. Does that sound familiar?
I haven't used it, but.
Oh, you said you haven't used it, okay.
I have used other machine learning tools within ArcGIS, but not that specific.
I see, yeah, this is specifically deep learning. I found some of the other ones I have used for my teaching. I've used random forest and gradient boosting. Those seem to work pretty well. But I have, and I don't know, that probably would be an interesting project actually, is to study, run the exact same model in ArcGIS and Python. And you can run YOLO in both and see what results you get.
Thank you.
Yes.
Andy?
I'm a little bit surprised that you went with mosaics and sidescan for training your model. There's so much more information in the in the original past that shadows are cut off at the and in a mosaic things get overlaid sometimes, and you get sort of a couple things in the same thing in two different places. And
Yes.
so I mean, is it really that much of a cost in terms of the time?
Yeah, so let me tell you why. There's actually it's just very functional, the reason that I do it that way. So I do, the way that I do it is I use two separate mosaics, which I think I said. I do the odd numbered legs and the even numbered legs, and I use two separate mosaics. When I started, I was training on line by line. But what happens is, because this is still in development, is we go to the field for a month, and every night I run I have my trained model, and we collect new data. And then the new data is, it's better to run the new data through the model the same way you're running the old data. So we run two vehicles at once, so 4 square kilometers of data. I run that line by line through the model. That takes 3 hours to run. When I'm done with that, if I've identified a couple things that I'm sure are planes, I can tell without even doing a reacquire, I retrain the model. That takes another 2 hours. I did that for 3 weeks, and at the end of 3 weeks, the PI was like, Leila, I miss having you as part of the team. You're missing dinner every night and eating by yourself, and this isn't fun for everybody, and it wasn't fun for me either. So because of that computational, it's just really slow. So for that reason, we haven't run it that way. I think that probably as computing power gets faster, maybe an external GPU, you're right. Line by line is a more powerful model. It just is really, really slow, and it's hard to run on the hardware that I have. If I were doing it on a supercomputer or on even something at A&M, that's the approach to take. You're totally right.
Can you just parallelize it across a whole bunch of machines? Can you take 10 laptops?
I could. I think it would be we already, when a lot of these places we go, we're already bringing 30 cases that are each 100 pounds. So it just becomes yes, but it would be very annoying.
Any more question? Okay, we have 2 more. Okay, go for it.
So with this aircraft data set of what was it, 16 different, 19 different?
19, yeah.
Yeah, 19 different. Have you considered, say there's a big storm event or something coming through, resurveying those same aircraft so you get the same or a different representation with perhaps some added degradation?
Yes, yeah. So let me give a 2-part answer. So first of all, something I did not say is that most of the aircraft wrecks we're finding, so we have a pretty hard bottom on how deep we survey, or how deep we fly the vehicle. And we generally don't go below about 140 feet. And that is because we just don't want to lose it. So if there's a problem, we want to be able to dive and recover it. That doesn't mean we haven't lost these before, but generally we try not to go deeper than that. But most of the aircraft wrecks we find are most of them are over 100 feet. It's unusual to find some that are deeper, so between 100 and 140 feet. So they are probably less affected than things that are shallower by weather. That being said, we do resurvey. So almost everything in the study areas we go back to, like the North Pacific, we've done six or 7 field deployments there. And we almost always do spend part of our time resurveying. And I've found exactly, it's like the multi-line approach you mentioned. On top of the multi-line approach, if you have different angles and different conditions under which you collect the data, you do end up with a bigger data set. And it would be good. In fact, our funding agency is not buying it, but there's a place in the North Pacific that's called the Airplane Graveyard, where a bunch of aircraft were disposed after World War II. And some of them are in pieces, some of them are a little too intact to be useful, but I have proposed several times just going and doing a mission just to survey, to build a more robust training data set.
Yeah, Juliet, and that will be the last. Do we have any question online?
Not that I know of.
Okay, yeah, Juliet.
So building on the things that are not it, but Pacific where you've got a lot of man-made objects, are those things that other people might have already classified for the most part, or are they just random pieces of metal?
Not at all. Yeah, not at all. Almost all the places we're working, like nobody has imaged the seafloor at all. There's like almost no information that exists. In fact, actually, we've talked about like we have this huge data set of the seafloor and just building like a side scan sonar model to classify the seafloor.
Are there other objects that would be distinguishable from that kind of
Yes.
class? Because like frequently there are lots of categories that other people have tried to classify because they've got a lot of them that are big metal debris objects.
Yeah.
Planes are kind of unusual.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of other debris things, which is like refrigerators, cars,
Yeah.
broken things.
Cars, trucks, barges, yeah.
There's all sorts of big
We've seen-
metal trash.
Yes, yes.
There are lots of images of, and a lot of the contractors that do lots of side scan do have like image collections of.
Yeah.
And I would think that might, if you had lots of those counter detections where you're detecting it and then removing
Yes.
what's left as, is this a big thing, that
Yes.
might have a different set of, because especially if you're looking for the unknown.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that could be very powerful, especially because sometimes we waste dives. We have like a weird thing that looks like a radio tower. That was something we dove on last year. It didn't seem like aircraft debris, but like looked like a radio tower. And we dove on that and that was some garbage like from a ship, like something from a ship. But yeah, I do think there could certainly be value if other people have created models to classify underwater junk, eliminating those, because this is like something we're using and we're trying to be as efficient as possible and do as few dives as possible. So to be able to eliminate things that we just, with our eyes, we're not accurately able to classify.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, let's thank our speaker.